I was woken up from my deep sleep due to hearing my golden retriever, Goldilocks, barking in an alarming way. I forced my groggy body to move, but the best I could do was roll over to wrap my arms around my wife's body. Realizing that she wasn't even home because she was out on a college trip with her students for a conference, it managed to wake me up a little bit more. Hearing Goldilocks bark the way she was, I had to get out of bed to see what was going on. Could it be a raccoon or a cat that she could be barking at? She doesn't really get that way if it is though. That being said, Goldilocks is more of an indoor dog since she is very timid, gentle dog that is 4 years old. Our house is on the edge of the city in a neighborhood packed with people that usually gets quiet when the sun goes down. The only special thing about my house is that my backyard is connected to the park. It is more of a mountain nature reservoir where there are many hiking trails that you can choose from. At this point, I'm slowly walking to the front door where Goldilocks is, but the moment I hear the front door being rattled and shook, I fully awaken immediately and run to the front door. "What is it, Goldilocks?" I say as I rub her forehead to calm her down. I turned to the last corner and I was more confused as I saw my son, Tommy, trying to open the door to go outside. Tommy's 4 years old as well, but he knows that he's supposed to only go outside with me or his mom. "Tommy?" I say in a confused voice. I just stared at my son as he was frantically trying to open the door, but it was as if the kid had never seen a door opened in his life. His hand kept slipping off the knob. "Tommy!" This time in a parental tone. However, Tommy is still pulling on the doorknob, completely ignoring my entire presence right behind him. I gently put my hand on his shoulder, fearing that he's sleepwalking and I don't want to startle him. "Tommy, wake up, mijo." I turn him around and he's suddenly woken up. "Dad?" he says in a sleepy tone. He had zero idea where he was, so I told him that he was at the front door, and I will carry him to bed. I carry him to my room to sleep him, just in case he sleepwalks again. By the time we get there, he is already fast asleep. I hear Goldilocks follow behind me, and I shut the door so the three of us are in the same room. I hope that if Tommy walks again, Goldilocks would be there to bark me awake again. Bang, bang, bang! I wake up feeling my heart pumping out of my chest as I hear something kicking at the front door. I look over to Tommy, but he's nowhere on my bed. My room door is open and Goldilocks wakes up as confused as I am. I rush to the front door and this time, Tommy is forcing the door open by any means necessary. He's kicking at it, clawing his nails against the frame and pulling down at that knob. "Tommy, what are you doing?" I say with a hint of fear in my voice. I need to let the... Tommy was blabbering his words that I couldn't even understand. Wants me to let it inside our house. Tired of hearing my son's nonsense, I turn him around and I look at him in the eyes and I gasp and fall on the floor. Tommy's eyes are blinking rapidly like a strobe light and his eyeballs are looking up as high as they possibly could. I couldn't even see the brown of his eyes. I snap out of this frightening episode that I was in and pick up Tommy and try to calm him down. He finally stopped his panic mumbling and he began crying in my arms. I finally managed my heart to stop beating so hard and I carried him back to my room. I summed this all up to his mother not being home and possibly having a nightmare or two. I laid Tommy in my bed, but this time I don't fall back asleep. I stepped out of the room and I checked the front door. I didn't know what I was expecting to see, probably me just being paranoid. I make sure to check that every door is locked. Goldilocks is following right behind me, and as I make my way back to the sliding door, I find that it was opened. The curtain was waving slightly in the wind. I stood in my tracks as Goldilocks stood in front of me. She began to growl and snarl her teeth. I picked up a nearby fireplace poker and walked towards the door. I gripped on the fire poker so tightly that I bet my knuckles were white at that point. As I stepped closer to the door, I held the fire poker above my head. I turned the backyard light on and I pulled away from the curtain, but there was nothing there. It was like clockwork because Goldilocks stopped snarling at the exact same time once she saw that it was clear. The breeze began to pick up some more and I slammed the sliding door, making sure that the door was locked this time. I swore that I locked it, but with me being too busy making both Tommy and Goldilocks a chicken meal, I could have forgotten to lock it. I was now sitting on the chair that my wife uses to put her makeup just to stay awake. I looked at the time and it was 2:02 AM by now, and I had at least 4 more hours until the sun came up. I don't know why, but just having the sun shining in the sky made me feel more hopeful that this would all go back to normal. I debated on whether to call my wife or not about this late in the evening. I decided that it would just be a conversation that could be had until the morning. Goldilocks was walking in and out of the room like she usually does in the morning, and that means that she's looking for food. I look up at Tommy, who's sound asleep, and I get up to reheat some chicken for Goldilocks. I leave the plate of dog food in the kitchen and head back to my room, and I see that Tommy is sitting up in the bed. He's staring at me in a way that no 4-year-old should ever be looking at you. I'm frozen at my door, and before I could say a word, Tommy says, "The Nightwalkers has printed its presence here and is stalking us. It craves the blood that it lusts for." What? I say as I feel the strength of my legs leave, and I have to use the door to hold me up. Tommy falls back into the bed and falls back asleep as if nothing happened. As soon as he does, I hear behind me Goldilocks scream a bloody cry and instantly is silent. Tommy wakes up, shaking in fear, after hearing Goldilocks. I run to the kitchen and I find Goldilocks laying on the floor, in a pool of blood. Before this, I've never heard a dog gargle to its death in its own blood. I fall to my knees as I grab a nearby towel and try to find the wound it's coming from. I pull her on my lap and roll her over. I find where the blood is coming from, and I see 3 giant slashes that reach her from her lower neck down to her hip. I'm crying like a baby, looking all around, trying to see how this could have happened. But the only blood I see is from the pool that I am in. Tommy comes up from behind me and says, "Dad, why is the back door opened?" "Opened?" I cry out as I hush Tommy out the kitchen. I hope that Tommy didn't see a thing, but I can't tell for sure. I tell him to go to my room as I lock the sliding door and check the entire house. I call the cops. It takes the cops 10 minutes to knock on my door, and it was the longest 10 minutes waiting for them. My head was sticking out the window, waiting to see those blue flashing and red lights. I let them in immediately and they check the house as well, but find nothing. The best they could do is call for their K9 unit to properly handle Goldilocks. They have a few questions for me, but none of them lead anywhere. We have no idea how the back door was opened after I made sure to lock it. After they left, I cleaned up everything, and it was the most heartbreaking thing that I've ever done. When that was done, I showered to wash off of my dog's blood for my hands and legs. I just watched the blood run down the drain and couldn't handle it anymore. I got out of the shower and made myself a drink and made sure my bedroom door was locked before I crawled into bed. It was 4 o'clock by the time I managed to actually fall asleep. It's now 8:30 and I'm about to call my wife and tell her everything that had happened. I don't know how I'm going to explain this to her. I really miss my Goldilocks, but I'm more concerned about what Tommy said before Goldilocks' unfaithful death. What was the Nightwalker? And if it's stalking my house, what can I do? My wife is coming home tonight. Am I really deciding on staying here or staying at a hotel or something? It might just be paranoia, but is there something I should look into? Was it just a mountain lion that found its way in? But then explain the back door opening twice when I clearly locked it. Only time will tell. I will keep this post updated if anything happens. Best wishes. I'm a guy. This was probably 9 or 10 years ago. I was in my mid-30s and out of town with some co-workers at an IT conference for the week. It was a nice town, and as these things go, at least the main street was anyway. Anyways, one night, one of the companies sponsoring the conference had an open bar night at a club there. Can you see where this is going? Of course, I drank too much. And after the rest of my co-workers left to go back to the hotel, I stayed and kept drinking. The bar closed, and on my way back, someone else from the conference decided to take it on himself to make sure I got back to the hotel safely. I didn't want to, and quite frankly wasn't asked to him about it. We got back to my hotel and I decided what I really needed was a cigarette. So when the guy left, I went to a different exit to find a store that was open at 2 a.m. to get a pack of smokes. Back then, I used to smoke when I was drinking. Not anymore. I walked up and down the main street trying to find a place that was open, but everything was closed. I ran into a couple that I assumed were locals and asked them if they knew of any store that was open at this hour so I could get some smokes. They said, "Sure, follow us." They started leading me off the main street. and after a couple blocks, my drunken brain started to realise we were quickly getting into a dangerous, run-down part of town. So I started asking how far it was. It's right over here, they kept saying. Then we get into this construction site, and I was really scared. It's right down here, they said. I looked where they were pointing, and it was a dark alleyway. No way, man. I said, okay, I'm right behind you, and bolted in the other direction in a full sprint. I rounded a corner, slipped on some gravel, and wiped out. Tore multiple holes in my jeans. My palm was full of gravel and bleeding. I hid behind a dumpster for a few minutes and heard them walking back, talking to each other. I couldn't tell what they were saying. When I couldn't hear them anymore, I ran back to the main street because it was still well lit, and my hotel was several blocks down on the main street, so that was my lifeline to safety. On my way back, I could hear them the next block or two over, shouting, "Where did that guy go?" And I started hearing additional voices with them. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were unquestionably talking to the original two. I hurried to the hotel and got to my room and quickly passed out, still pretty drunk, but sobered a bit from the adrenaline. I'm quite sure I narrowly avoided getting robbed, or worse, in that dark alley, and they were looking for me a while after I ran off. That guy that tried to get me safely back to my hotel deserves some props and an apology for bugging out on him like that afterwards. Unfortunately, I didn't see him the rest of the conference, but I probably would have been too embarrassed to say anything to him back then. This was 1992. My mother was going through a bad patch in her marriage and chemotherapy for breast cancer. We lived in a very quiet town where residential areas only had small markets. For everything else, including pharmacy and public calls, we had to go to the main market, which is about 3.5 miles from our house, 1.5 miles from our apartment blocks to the main road, and then 2 miles to the market, either by walk or public transport. My mother, who was going through some tough time given my father's complete disconnect with us, she used to call my brother, my uncle, for advice and catharsis, who lived in another city. For those calls, she had to go to the public call office, which was run by two weird men. The same market had the pharmacy where my mother would buy her medicines. I was 11, and my older sister was 17. One evening, my mother, along with my sister, went to the PCO to talk to my uncle. I don't remember why, but I think my father asked her to leave the house, and she wanted to discuss her options. She was in distress and didn't realise it was already late when she finished the call. The market was closed, so was the public transport. My mom and sister paid the bill and started their walk on the path next to the main road. The two PCO owners closed the PCO and started following them. One on foot right behind them, trying to offer a ride, and the other on bicycle next to them on the deserted main road. My mother strictly refused, held my sister's hand tightly, and started walking as fast as she could, when a white van appeared on the service road and started driving slowly next to them. The PCO guys had already arranged a ride with some really bad intentions and didn't seem to go away. They were probably waiting for them to get off the main road to strike. On the next turn, two men came from the opposite side on the footpath. And to my mother's relief, it was the pharmacist and his friend who were returning to pick his car from his shop's parking after a walk. They saw the men in the van and immediately realised what was going on. They stopped, said hello, and asked if she needed help. They agreed to walk them home. The PCO men fled upon seeing the guys. The kind pharmacist saw my mother and sister to the safety of our house. My mother never went to that PCO again. Several years ago, when I was 25, I lived with, at the time, one of my best friends. Our friendship eventually started to dwindle, as it usually does when you move in with a good friend, so she was rarely home. This night, however, she ended up staying at our place, heading to bed early. I was a server at the time, so I stayed up pretty late, usually watching YouTube and smoking pot. This night was no different than any other, except for the fact my neighbours tried to kidnap me. I'll go ahead and give you some background info on my house and my neighbours. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with 2 bedrooms and the kitchen facing the crazy neighbours. They were a younger couple, living in a smaller mill house. They were constantly coming to our door asking for handouts. Now, Normally I'm happy to help a neighbour out, but they would come over and ask for crazy shit, like for us to fill up an old Mountain Dew bottle with water because theirs got shut off, beer, and once literally to ask for $1. They would consistently be knocking at the door to ask for help, and we wouldn't answer. I'd peek through the window to see them either jacking cigarette butts from the ashtray or pressing their eyeballs against the door peephole to see if they could spot us. Anyway, there I was smoking some weed and watching YouTube on my couch when I heard a knock at the door. I rolled my eye because I knew exactly who came a knocking. It's 11 PM. I checked the peephole, and sure enough, the boyfriend was on my porch. Normally I'd just walk away and continue with my life, but it looked like he was in distress. I opened the door to see what was up. Hey, I just wanted to come over and see if you would film my engagements. I got my girlfriend a ring here in my pocket, and I need you to follow me into my backyard and film it for me. Baffled, but curious, I told him congrats and said I'd be out in a second. I just needed to put some shoes on. I shut the door behind me and locked it. Quickly, I ran to the back room that looked out into the backyard. I peeked through the blinds to see the setup. Nothing. Pitch black darkness, no sign of decorations or anything like that. Naturally, I woke my roommate up and told her what was going on. Yeah, fuck that, she said to me, and we both walked back up to the door after the boyfriend started banging on it. I looked through the peephole again. I couldn't see anything and was confused, all the way up until he pulled his eyeball away from the peephole. I quickly turned around and put my back up against the door. My roommate came and rumbled back to the door from her room, manning 2 wire hangers for protection. We both clung onto the hangers and sat up against the door until he finally left. We were so freaked out, but we wanted to make sure we were overreacting. We went out our back door and hopped into her car so we could do a drive-by. They always had their front door open and also didn't have any blinds, so it was easy to see in their house. Slowly we crept by in her car and peered into the living room. Sitting on the couch and all staring at the wall, they looked strung out, was the couple and an older man. We sped off and ended up staying at a friend's house that night. I never answered the door for either of them again. One day I came home from work and an older lady was parked in their driveway. She walked up to me as I got out of my car and asked if I knew who the neighbours were. I told her I hadn't seen them for a while, and she informed me she was the owner. She told me they were months late on rent and finally came to evict them. She entered the home to find it completely trashed, needles and garbage everywhere, holes on the wall, and literal shit on the floor. I told her I was sorry to hear that she had to deal with all of that, but I was happy they were finally gone. I'm not 100% sure what was going on that night, but I'm glad I didn't follow him into the backyard. Years ago, when I lived in a small town with my then boyfriend, a crackhead used to come regularly to my door. We lived in a small old mill house that was about $400 a month. I'd just moved out of my parents' house, and $400 was a pretty good deal for being right outside of a fairly large city. However, there were some consequences that came with living in such an affordable home. There was a local cracker that would always go door to door asking for handouts. She was a middle-aged lady who was clearly on some serious drugs and didn't take no for an answer. My first encounter with her was not a direct one. I was in the shower when I heard my pit bull aggressively barking. She never does this. I called on my boyfriend, but no answer. I quickly washed my hair out and get out of the shower to figure out what was going on. As I walked out of the living room, I found my dog, who was whimpering and staring out our front door. We had a glass door. As well as my boyfriend's shotgun leaning up against the wall next to the door. Odd. I freaked out a little because my boyfriend's car was gone. I tried calling him, but found his phone ringing on the couch. At this point, I'm not sure if I could call the cops or wait, as my ex was an arsehole and would probably scold me for worrying if there was, in fact, nothing wrong. After about 10 minutes of anxiously considering my options, my dumbass boyfriend pulls back into our driveway with a woman in his front seat. He eventually comes back in and explains that she came to the door asking for a ride to the gas station to get kerosene for a heater. I didn't understand why he brought his gun out to answer the door. I wasn't going to ask any more questions. After this, she would constantly come to our house asking for different things like cigarettes, beer, and more rides to different places. My ex would always oblige. One night she came to the door asking for, I believe, alcohol. But we didn't have any to give, so she asked my ex for $5. He gave her the money and came back inside. This was my breaking point. I don't know, I didn't feel comfortable with her coming to the door, and then we had to stop giving her things. I would normally be more than happy to help someone out, but for her to come to the door every other day was becoming too much. I told him that every time he wasn't home, for it she would constantly bang on the door for about 10 minutes, and would eventually yell out vulgar comments about me and storm off. He said that he didn't want to say no, and didn't know how to get rid of her. One night my ex wasn't home, and I had a work friend over for dinner and drinks. It was around 10 PM when I got a knock at the door. It was the crackhead. She asked me for a ride, and I told her I had guests over and couldn't. She then proceeded to put her hand against my door as if to hold it open, and asked me where my man was, my ex. I told her he wasn't home. My girlfriend walked over to make sure I was okay. The crackhead told her she needed to go to McDonald's because she's a diabetic, and her doctor said she needed to be on a special diet of hamburgers. My friend, who's in the medical field, told her that doesn't seem good. Angrily, the crackhead said they were making a special hamburgers. Over it, I began to shut the door, but she pushed back. Well, can I have a beer? She asked. I shot her a dirty look for trying to fight back on shutting my door. I told her no, and with the help of my friend, we finally got the door shut as they screamed, "What about a cigarette?" She sat outside my house yelling until she eventually walked away. I told my ex about the incident, and we finally agreed not to answer anymore. I work a long commute away from home and depend on the train. There were some issues that caused the trains to be cancelled for hours, which left me stranded about 1.5 hours drive from home. At the train station, there were a few others who were all heading to my city, and we decided to split a taxi. The people were Woman 1, we'll call her Lisa. She's heading to my city to see a gig. She was a bit tipsy. Man 1, we'll call him Kyle. Travelling with Lisa, they're not dating, but from their conversations seemed like friends or maybe fuck buddies. He was beyond drunk, and it made me a bit uncomfortable because he was pissing in a bush and kept making vulgar comments about Lisa's hot cousin. Man 2, we'll call him John. He was travelling alone and mentioned that he lived in the city, just moved there but was in that town we were leaving from as he just broke up with his girlfriend and he was picking stuff up from her place. Woman 2, who I'll mention later. Woman 2 decides to stay at her mother's house in the town for another evening, so drops out of the taxi ride. That should have been my cue to also drop out. But they just run the taxi, and so I didn't want to ruin it, as they already calculated how much we all needed to pay. I decided to say to Lisa if I could sit next to her in a taxi. She said, "I completely understand. Come on, I'll sit in the middle." So the seating arrangement was drunk Kyle sat at the front, me sat on the side, and Lisa sat in the middle. Came time for John to get into the taxi. Mind, from where we were parked, there was no danger to getting in from the other side, as there was no oncoming cars. He opened the door on my side and just stared at me. Then Lisa says cheerfully for him to sit the other side, as she wanted the middle seat to talk to Kyle more easily. John stared at us for about a second more, then scoffed, and slowly walked over to the other side and got in. The ride itself was awkward, as Lisa and Kyle were both drunk and dirty laundry was aired. How I know that they were fuck buddies. Lisa was drinking still, before she finally said she needed to go to the toilet and was desperate. The taxi man found a public leisure centre for him to pull into. She got out and went inside. Mistake number 2. I should have went with her, but I just didn't think about it. Normally I go with female friends in restaurants or bars, but because it was a taxi and freezing outside, I just stayed. Kyle and John went outside the taxi to smoke a cigarette. Then John came back in when we saw Lisa coming out. He scooted over to the middle and put his hand on my upper thigh and rested it there. Regret number 3, I should have said something and made a scene, but I just froze completely. Lisa opened the door, looked at John and looked at me, then looked at John's hand on my upper thigh 2 inches away from my vagina. She cheerfully said to him, "Oh, I'm sorry. Please can we switch? I love sitting middle." John looked pissed. He looked over at me. He was still frozen, removed his hand from my thigh, and scooted out to make room for her. He grumbled something I couldn't hear before Lisa said thank you and came in next to me. John sat in his proper seat this time and we took off. Lisa then took my hand and whispered to me, woman to woman, I'll make sure you get home safely. I was just tearing up and said thank you. Then, throughout the journey, about 4 or 5 times after, Lisa leaned forward to speak to Kyle. John slipped his hand to her seat, so when she sat back down, he would touch her arse. Every time she just giggled and said, oh sorry, I think you are on your hand then. I felt awful because she was in this position because of me. So I apologised and she just repeated that she'll get me home safely, woman to woman. She was very drunk at this point from the exit taxi drinking, so I think she just latched onto that mission. When we got close to the city centre, Lisa asked me where I needed to get to and I told her the general area. John said he moved to an area that is literally in the opposite direction. His suburb is north, I'm south of the city. He said after Kyle and Lisa got out, we'll share a taxi together. Despite that making no sense as we lived in opposite directions. I said no, that's fine, but he was insistent. Won't take no for an answer. Lisa was too drunk and crying about how much she loves her dog at this point to protect me. I texted my husband that I was terrified and if he could walk up to come get me. My husband fucking booked it over as fast as he could. After we got out of the taxi, John was getting his bags out of the trunk and I said bye to Lisa and just ran as fast as I could to make it to my husband. We say it all the time, but it needs to be said again. Fuck being polite when you feel scared. John probably latched onto me because I was travelling along with Lisa, with that man. Also, Lisa is right. Girls need to stick together. I should have gone to the toilet with her. This happened to me in February, so a few months ago now. I was at the Greyhound station where I live, on my way back from visiting my parents. It was about 1 AM, and I was having a little bit of trouble getting an Uber. I live near a relatively big city, so there were always taxis around, and there were several outside of the bus station, so I walked up to one and asked if he had any passengers. He told me that no, he could take me. I told him where I lived, and asked him if he could roughly estimate how much it would cost. I'm broke. He told me he'd give me a ride for free. When he told me that, I was already half in his car, and that made me freeze, with literally 1 foot in and 1 foot on the pavement. I asked him if he was sure, because I wanted to make sure that that's what he actually said, and he also had a very thick accent, so I wanted to be sure that I hadn't misunderstood him. He assured me that he did in fact mean that he would drive me for free. I very politely noped right out of there, making up something about my friend coming to get me after all, which I have no doubt he saw right through. I got my suitcase and went back into the building, got the security guard and told him what happened. I felt a little dumb telling the security guard that this happened, because at that point, I was thinking he was maybe just trying to hit on me rather than hurt me. It had just come off as a bit creepy. I did have a very weird feeling. Because of this, I decided not to trust any of the other taxis outside and called for one instead. I even requested a woman, because the encounter made me feel really icky. It was late at night. I'm a 21-year-old female travelling by myself. I was just very paranoid. Well, as I was waiting right outside, the doors for the taxi I had called, the driver drove right up to me and stuck his arm out of the window, showing me a fistful of cash, saying he would pay me to get in the car with him. When I say ran back to the security guard, I know that this wasn't like the most dangerous situation, like he never pulled a weapon or tried to force me to get in the car, but I truly believe I would have gotten hurt if I'd gotten in that car and driven away with him. I told my girlfriend and roommate as soon as I got home, and they both agreed, as well as saying that maybe he wasn't a taxi driver at all. Where I live is right off a major highway and a major human trafficking hotspot. So maybe it was just a guy pretending to be a taxi driver to pick up girls, travelling alone. I don't know. It left me pretty spooked. I bought my first house in 2003 and I was over the moon. Shortly after moving in, Two of my neighbours began joking with me about the ghosts in my house. Well, I thought they were joking, so I just played along, pretending I'd seen one, and it was no big deal. As time went on that summer, I met more and more of my neighbours, and they all brought up the same topic. Finally, an elderly woman on the block who was quite kind and friendly told me a story after I'd asked her. I knew she wasn't going to screw with my head, which is why I asked her in the first place. Turns out, the previous owner purchased the home and never lived there because she said it was haunted. Sounds in the night of footsteps and sobbing, and glimpses of a man sitting in the kitchen covered in blood. One of my neighbours helped with the renovations of the house and said that he was putting up drywall when he felt something lift up his dreadlocks. Though I've had paranormal experiences before, it had been years, and by then I just chalked it up to night terrors. One day I went to a small neighbourhood video store to rent a movie. I had to fill out a form with my demographic data and my credit card info. The owner of the store looked at the form and said, "Oh my god, you live in that house?" I asked her what she meant, and she explained that her former employee had committed suicide in my house. She came to the house as soon as she'd heard, but the house had been taped off by police as a potential crime scene. She told me that he had just moved into the house with his partner and called his mom because he wanted to invite her over to meet his partner and come out to her. This was in the early 90s when being gay was a big deal. His mother already knew he was gay because he bought a house with a man and disowned him right over the phone. That same week, he received a letter from a HIV testing centre stating that he'd tested positive. This is when HIV was a death sentence. He then sat at the kitchen table, ate a bowl of cereal, and shot himself in the head with a revolver. Since then, she's had multiple paranormal experiences in the store, with videos flying off shelves and even levitating off of them. The most I've experienced is sounds at night. Sounds of Cheerios being poured into a bowl. I don't eat cereal. And sounds of sobbing in the kitchen. I often awaken to both. I remember my grandmother saying, "When the dead come to you, they want something. Perform an act of charity in their name and pray for them." So I did. I sat down at the kitchen table one night and lit a candle and told him that each night I would recite a novena prayer for him before I lit candle. On the 9th night of the first novena to St. Anthony, patron saint of lost souls, I heard uncontrollable sobbing. I felt a strong presence of grief and despair, and the sound of hyperventilating, breathing, as though someone couldn't catch the breath. I sat in the presence of this knowing it was not malignant, but rather a connection of intimacy and compassion, of which he was in need. For 45 days, I said a novena prayer before I lit candle for his soul, and had a mass said in his name. A few times I had awakened to feel his presence standing over my bed, but knew it was not a malignant presence. This still happens from time to time, but less and less frequently.